dating is tough. Once you finally wade through the bots, ads, and scammers to meet an actual person, the real guessing game begins. Why is this person even available right now? Are they genuinely just down on their luck, or is there something darker lurking beneath? Then, if you're lucky enough to uncover their quirks, the question becomes, can they handle your own? This cycle of endless questioning can take months, often leading to a dead end, leaving you feeling exhausted and ready to retreat into a life of solitude. So, when I started seeing Wendy, I wasn't naive. I knew dating was full of quirks and surprises. Recently, I posted about Wendy's peculiar habit of never eating around me and the strange noises I'd heard coming from her house. But, despite those oddities, I chose to keep seeing her. Sure, she had some strange habits, but being with her made me happy, and that was enough. So what if she never seemed to eat or chased off bears while, unclothed? Compared to returning to the dating scene, this was hardly a deal-breaker. We'd even picked up nicknames for each other, Cowgirl and City Boy. I'll let you guess who's who. Anyway, that's a long way of saying that, yes, I went camping with Wendy. And let's just say things didn't go quite as planned. I have to admit, she was right about the woods. They were absolutely breathtaking. The combination of the sun's warmth, cool shade, and the background hum of insects felt like a lullaby slowing time, making every breath feel like a cleansing escape. Wendy made it even better. She had all sorts of tips to make the hike easier, like how to adjust my pack weight and lace up for max comfort. She'd alternate between sharing interesting tidbits about the local plants and animals and walking in silence, allowing me to fully immerse myself in the beauty of it all. Honestly, it made me wonder if I could really give up city life and move somewhere quieter. There was only one weird moment. At one point, a terrible smell hit us, probably a skunk or something rotting nearby. At first, it wasn't too strong, but it quickly grew unbearable, almost gag-worthy. I joked about it, but Wendy, looking completely unbothered, just said, "Pick up the pace. We'll get past it soon." Sure enough, the smell faded, and we went back to enjoying the hike. Wendy even helped me set up the tent once we reached our campsite. Her experience showed, and soon, we had a cozy setup complete with a fire crackling nearby. Later, when she pulled out dinner, I wasn't even fazed that it was only enough for one. Whatever was going on with her, I'd made peace with it. But she surprised me by making a perfect steak, which tasted even better after a day of hiking. We had a great evening, and when we finally turned in for the night, listening to the quiet symphony of crickets and owls, it felt almost magical. But then I woke up alone in the tent. Wendy wasn't there, and while that didn't surprise me much, she's a bit of a night owl. After all, the night outside seemed unusually still. I thought about calling out, but something about the silence told me not to disrupt it. Still, nature called, so I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. As I looked up, the night sky was breathtaking, something I rarely got to see so vividly back in the city. But even this beauty couldn't distract me for long. I quickly took care of business, feeling an almost euphoric sense of relief. I might have missed the fact that the night had gone completely silent. Then I noticed a new smell, much stronger than before, a sickly, rotten stench. It was worse than anything I'd smelled on the trail. I tried to hold my breath and hurried back into the tent, fumbling in the dark. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. Something in my gut told me it was better not to shine a light. I couldn't shake the feeling that turning it on would make me a beacon for whatever was out there. So I sat quietly in the darkness, hearing my heartbeat thud in my chest, painfully loud in the quiet night. Thankfully, after what felt like forever, the smell faded, but the adrenaline left me wired and wide awake. The next morning, I woke up with Wendy snuggled up beside me, her presence somehow grounding me. Waking up, I found Wendy sprawled over me, one arm and a leg draped across. She was entirely bare, which surprised me since I thought she'd gone to bed wearing pajamas. But as she stirred, giving me a sleepy smile, I suddenly didn't mind. She looked up and teased, "You sleep okay, city kid? Seemed like you had some pretty rough dreams last night." In the morning light, her words made perfect sense. Whatever happened last night was probably just a vivid dream, stirred up by the day's experiences and the unfamiliar woods. After a little more time together, we decided to get up and face another day in the wilderness. When I finally crawled out of the tent, I noticed our whole camp was in disarray. It looked like something had come through and tossed everything around. A few of the more fragile items were completely destroyed. I called out, "Hey, you should come take a look at this." Wendy crawled out, scrunching her face. "Probably a bear," she shrugged. "They usually stay away, but I guess that one's on me, sorry." A bear. That made some sense, I told myself. As we cleaned up, I even found tracks, but to my untrained eye, they looked more like they belonged to a dog than a bear. A very large dog, or maybe a wolf. What was even stranger were the prints that looked like hoof marks. Judging by their size, these deer must have been much bigger than they looked on TV. Each print was over twice the length of my hand. Not much else happened during the day. We tidied up, had breakfast, went for a hike, made dinner, and settled in for the night. I'd started to relax again, almost forgetting the strange happenings from the night before. But that night, things took a more unsettling turn. I woke in the middle of the night, Wendy still half asleep, draped over me. That smell was back, stronger than before, and the light was bright enough to cast shadows in the tent, maybe from a full moon. I looked up just in time to see the shadow of an enormous deer pass between us and the night sky. But something wasn't right. This deer looked way too tall, like it was standing on hind legs. Then it opened its mouth, and I glimpsed sharp, gleaming teeth. My heart started racing. I felt Wendy stir beside me, and suddenly felt a wave of protectiveness. Whatever was out there, I couldn't let it get to her. I was about to tell her to keep quiet when I saw her looking at me, holding a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. Then she whispered, "Stay in the tent," and began to get up. I panicked and grabbed her arm, unwilling to let her face whatever that was alone. But when she looked back at me, I let her go immediately, almost as afraid of her as I was of whatever was outside. Her eyes reflected light back at me like a cat's, and I could see her nails elongating, turning into claws as I watched. In seconds, she turned, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The sound that followed will stay with me forever. After I got home, I tried researching it and would describe it as a mix between an elk call, a rabbit scream, and a mountain lion's cry, all impossibly loud. Wendy responded, her small human voice seeming fragile in comparison, until it, too, started shifting, morphing into a deep, resonant howl, like that of a massive wolf. I couldn't help myself. I peeked out through the tent flap. What I saw standing outside could only be described as a werewolf. Wendy, usually a petite 5-foot-something, was now towering at least 7 feet tall, covered in fur, with fangs and claws that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. She looked ready to fight. Movement from the far end of the camp caught my attention, and what I saw next made even Wendy's monstrous form seem less terrifying. It looked vaguely like a deer, but horribly distorted, with limbs far too long for its body. Its feet ended in hooves, but its hands had long, bony claws. The creature's skin was stretched so tightly over its ribs and limbs that you could see every bone, as if it were starving. It stood there, eyeing us, a living nightmare that made every horror story about the woods feel all too real. Beneath the fur, the creature's skin was patchy and seemed to be decaying, with open wounds oozing organic fluids that should never have seen the light of day. Its teeth were long and serrated, clearly designed for tearing rather than biting. I often heard hunters talk about deer with 8 or 10 points, but if I had to estimate, this beast had a 30-point horn, often covered in what I assumed was dried viscera from past victims. The two monsters charged at each other. The horrifying creature I later recognized as a Wendigo lowered its head to impale its opponent. Just in time, Wendy threw herself nearly flat on the ground, launching herself at the Wendigo and biting down hard on its neck with her powerful jaws. Her hind legs dug into its vulnerable belly, leaving gouges. However, the Wendigo wasn't ready to give in so easily. It threw Wendy aside, and she hit the ground hard, soon being set upon by the other beast. Wendy raised an arm to shield herself, but the Wendigo clamped down with its teeth, easily tearing through her skin and muscle. With a fierce kick, Wendy fought back, swiping at the Wendigo over and over, forcing it to lose ground. But when the Wendigo lowered its head again, Wendy wasn't quick enough. It impaled her on its tusks and flipped her over its back, fresh blood staining the tips of its prongs. Yet that wasn't the end. Wendy sprang back up and latched onto the Wendigo's neck from behind. The nightmare creature struggled helplessly, clawing at her, but she wouldn't relent. She began tearing through its neck until she finally seized its antlers, and with one last effort, the Wendigo's head came free. I don't have the heart to describe what happened next, but let's just say that the sound of flesh being torn and devoured is far more vivid through the thin fabric of a tent than it is through a closed cabin window. Time passed, maybe an hour or two. It was hard to say for sure. I didn't know what I expected to happen next. Perhaps I thought I would be next, or maybe I would wake up from this nightmare. In the end, the adrenaline faded, my eyelids grew heavy, and I dozed off again. When I woke up that morning, I was alone. This time, there was no sign of Wendy's return. I half hoped she would be there, telling me I'd had another nightmare, but I don't think I would have believed it. Packing up our things by myself felt a bit sad and lonely. I considered taking Wendy's stuff with me, but I wasn't a skilled enough climber and wasn't sure I could manage it, so I left her things in her pack inside the tent. Stepping outside, I was shocked to see Wendy sitting peacefully by the fire pit with no wounds in sight. She smiled at me sadly. "I guess I owe you an explanation," she said, as I took a moment to clear my mind. I hesitated before voicing my thoughts. "I had an idea earlier. You're not going to try and convince me this was a nightmare again, are you?" Wendy looked around at the destruction in the campground. Dirt kicked up, trees marked with claw marks, and blood splatter everywhere. "I don't think I could persuade you this time," she nodded, glancing around. "Yeah, I don't think so either," I replied, looking back at her. "I was starting to think you were the beast eating people out here." Wendy pointed at herself and then laughed. "Wait, you mean the Wendigo? Isn't that a bit on the nose?" I couldn't help it. As strange and messed up as everything was, as disturbing as it had all been, I realized this was the Wendy I knew and cared for, so I laughed along with her. "Sure, maybe my girlfriend is a 7-foot-tall beast that eats other creatures for fun, but everyone has their quirks. Besides, dating is hard, and I'm happy where I am."